Howdy folks. In this video we're going to be looking at the CFS3 Spitfire Mk.II that Steve, John, Rob, and myself have been working on. And in this video we're going to focus on the Mk.II Reflector Gunsight and some of its new features. And before we go further, I'd like to thank Encore for the great work he's been doing on the shaders over the past several years now for CFS3. And he's done a few special features specifically so that we could model this gunsight in the detail that we have done here. So thanks very much, Encore. Really appreciate it. So looking at this Mk.II Reflector Gunsight, this is the standard RAF gunsight for pretty much most of World War II. And what we're looking at here is the early version with the round reflector plate glass there. And that version was what they started the war with, and stayed in production through about 1941, sometime in there. We'll take a look at the controls here, and then we'll get to discussing a little bit more about how to use this thing. So we've got over here the toggle switch to turn it on and off. So you can see, turn it on and off there. And then next to it, we have this dimmer switch. We've got the daytime setting that it's on now. You can also turn it off on this dial there. So there's actually two ways to turn this thing on and off. And in addition to that, it also has a nighttime setting that dims the reticle. This helps with night vision for the pilot. Not having something bright right in front of where you're trying to see will really help you be able to see things on the other side of the reticle, which is pretty important if you're trying to hunt down a bomber in the night sky. And it can actually be dimmed even further than that. So we'll leave it back on the daytime setting for now. And we'll take a look at the reticle now. It's not just a pattern that doesn't mean anything. There's several things on here that are intended to be able to give you some information that'll be useful to you, though maybe not in the same way that the designers originally intended. So we've got the we've got the vertical bars here and the horizontal bars, and then you got the ring and the central aiming dot. That ring is known as a 100-mile-an-hour ring, and the idea is that it's designed to help a pilot estimate the correct aiming offset for deflection shooting. The idea is that if the target is crossing in front of you at a rate of 100 miles an hour, that's not its actual speed, but the rate at which it's crossing your flight path, you aim ahead of the target by putting the edge of the ring on the target with the central aiming dot ahead of it. And if the target is crossing at a rate of 50 miles an hour, you would put the target halfway between the ring and the central dot, and so on. Sounds great in theory. In practice, there's just no way you're going to be making calculations like that in a dogfight. But to make sense of why they designed it that way, it's helpful to know something about pre-war RAF tactics. In the years leading up to the war, the RAF hadn't had any real combat experience since World War I, and it was assumed that the massive advances in technology since that time had rendered many of the lessons they learned then obsolete. So instead, they developed what they called the fighter area attacks, which were standardized, choreographed attacks designed to bring the most guns to bear on an enemy formation at the same time as possible. In theory, it seemed organized and modern and efficient and all that. In reality, it was like walking into a bar fight and expecting everybody to follow the rules like it was a formal boxing match. Not going to happen. The Germans, who had developed excellent tactics from their experiences in the Spanish Civil War in the late 30s, had a name for these tactics when they encountered the RAF using them in the early months of World War II. They called them the row of idiots because they were so rigid and predictable. So it's easy to see how something like a 100-mile-an-hour ring might fit into all of this. When the Mk.II reflector sight was designed, it was assumed that these rigid, predictable fighter area attacks would be used, and this predictability and almost the pre-scripted nature of the attacks would allow the pilot to easily estimate the crossing speed of an enemy aircraft, since everything had already been worked out ahead of time. But reality isn't so clean and neat, and so soon the fighter area attacks were totally abandoned because they were useless in getting people killed, and pilots found a more practical use for this ring. And the way they used it was to estimate the range to the target to keep you from firing from too far away. Turns out that the wingspan of a single-seat fighter is roughly equal to the diameter of the ring at a range of 100 yards. And this is an excellent range to begin shooting. Moving on, the gap in the horizontal bar here is also significant. Unlike the 100-mile-an-hour ring, this feature was actually intended to help the pilot determine the range to a target, and it's adjustable. So that's the next thing we're going to look at here. You've got two ways that you can adjust the size of the gap between those two horizontal bars. You've got the range adjustment, here marked range 100 yards, and then the wingspan adjustment, marked base feet. And so the first one, we'll take a look at the target wingspan adjustment, and this lower ring here. Here you set the wingspan of the the target that you're expecting to be shooting at in feet. So anywhere between 100 feet over here or 30 feet over here. And we've modeled this adjustment in 2-foot increments. So we can adjust it down all the way down to 30 feet. You can see we've moved it all the way. The ring is adjusted all the way down to this 30-foot mark, and the gap is smaller since the target is smaller. We can also bring it all the way up to 100 feet. Now this, the size in the gap for this wingspan, bring it back sort of more to the middle, is valid for whatever range is set on the range adjuster. So here we have it at 250 yards. So this is the range that you want to open fire on your target. The range can be set anywhere between 150 over on this end and 700 yards over on this end. And we've modeled this adjustment in 10-yard increments. And so take a look at that. You can see the farther away the target is, obviously the smaller it's going to appear, and so the gap gets smaller. So here we're looking at how large a 60-foot wingspan target is going to look at 700 yards. And then bring it around to the 150. That's how big it's going to be. So you can kind of see, again, a little bit more of the pre-war rainbows and unicorns optimism that went into designing this gun sight, and that the designers and tacticians of the day apparently thought that these nice, predictable fighter area attacks would allow the pilot the time required to line up a 700-yard shot if he so chose. And practical experience soon showed that that was pretty unrealistic. So anyways, between these two adjustments, the gap in the horizontal bar is calibrated such that if the wingspan setting is set to match the wingspan of the target, for example, set 32 feet for a BF-109, the target's wingspan will span the gap in the horizontal bar at whatever range is set with the range adjustment ring. So from a practical perspective, one good way to set up your gun sight is to set your range to the gun convergence range. On these aircraft with wing-mounted guns, the guns don't fire straight ahead, but instead they're adjusted to all converge on a point a given distance ahead of the aircraft. This concentrates all of your firepower into a very small area for maximum effect. At the start of the war, the RAF's standard convergence range was set at 400 yards, and once again that kind of plays into those obsolete tactics that the pilots were trained to use. By the time our Spitfire Mk.II shows up on the frontline units, the convergence range had been reduced to a more practical 250 yards, so that's what we're going to set in here. So there's 250 yards. So now you can set the wingspan of your expected target and plan to hit him at that range where your guns are most effective. So there we go. 32 feet for our BF-109. So we're all set up to shoot him at 250 yards. Or alternatively, you can set up a single wingspan setting to represent different size targets at different ranges. So for instance, 60 to 70 feet is roughly the wingspan of your average Luftwaffe bomber. So we'll set the wingspan here to 60 feet. And then the convergence range here is set to 250 yards. So you can reasonably expect to hit a bomber on a fairly predictable flight path at this range. And since you're firing at convergence range, your rounds will have maximum effect against the sturdier bomber targets. But what you can also know with this setting is that a target of half the set wingspan, in this case a single-seat fighter, will span that same gap at half the set range. So a setting of 60 feet at 250 yards is also the same as 30 feet at 125 yards. At 125 yards, you're much more likely to hit a wildly maneuvering fighter, and in addition, at 125 yards, your guns are not firing in a tight concentration like they are at 250 yards. So instead, you get more of a shotgun type effect, which further increases your chances of a hit.